Margaret Foster's mother had been a cheesemaker in Africa before being captured and sold into American slavery, and she had taught her daughter secrets about fermentation that white plantation owners never understood or suspected existed. Margaret knew which bacteria created which flavors, which molds were safe and which were poisonous, how to control fermentation to achieve specific results. For 16 years, she used that knowledge to create exceptional cheese that brought profit to the Randolph family while bringing nothing to herself except continued enslavement. But in the spring of 1844, Catherine Randolph made a decision that sealed her own fate. She sold Margaret's 12-year-old daughter, Ruth, to a plantation in North Carolina, separating mother and child permanently to raise cash for redecorating the mansion. The moment Catherine counted out the money she had received for Ruth, Margaret began planning how the cheese aging room would become the setting for revenge, so perfectly disguised as natural illness that no one would ever suspect the gentle dairy woman of transforming her craft into murder. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Ruth had been born in 1832, Margaret's only living child, after two others had died in infancy from illnesses that the plantation's inadequate medical care couldn't treat. Margaret had raised Ruth in the dairy, teaching her daughter the craft of cheese-making from the time she could walk, hoping that valuable skills would provide some protection in a system designed to destroy black families. Ruth showed natural aptitude for the work, developing a sensitive palate that could identify subtle differences in aging cheese and gentle hands that handled delicate curds without damaging their structure. Mother and daughter had worked side by side for years, creating the cheese that made the Randolph plantation's dairy famous throughout the region. Then, in March 1844, Catherine Randolph decided she wanted to redecorate the mansion's drawing room with expensive imported wallpaper and French furniture. The cost required raising cash quickly, and selling Ruth, who at 12 was old enough to be valuable, but young enough that separation from her mother wouldn't diminish her work capacity, provided the funds Catherine needed. Margaret watched her daughter being loaded into a wagon bound for North Carolina. Ruth's tears and desperate calls for her mother echoing across the plantation yard while Catherine supervised from the porch, already planning her redecorating project. That was the moment when Margaret decided Catherine Randolph would die, though it would take 4 more months of patient poisoning before that decision manifested in reality. The year was 1844, and the Randolph plantation occupied 1,200 acres of prime Virginia dairy country, rolling hills covered with grass that provided ideal grazing for the dairy herd that was the estate's primary source of income. Unlike cotton or tobacco plantations that dominated much of the South, the Randolph property focused on producing cheese, butter, and milk products that commanded premium prices in Richmond and other urban markets, where wealthy customers paid substantial sums for high-quality dairy. The plantation house stood on a gentle rise, overlooking pastures where cows grazed during warmer months, a substantial brick structure that reflected the family's wealth and social standing. Behind the main house, perhaps 100 yards distant, stood the dairy complex, a collection of stone and wood buildings that included the milking barn, the processing room where Margaret worked with fresh milk, and most importantly, the aging room where cheese developed its distinctive flavors over weeks and months of careful tending. The aging room was Margaret's domain, a cool stone chamber built partially underground to maintain consistent temperature and humidity year-round. Margaret Foster had been born on the Randolph plantation in 1808, the daughter of a woman named Amara, who had been brought from West Africa only 5 years earlier. Amara had come from a people who had been making cheese for generations, using methods that predated European dairy practices, and she had carried that knowledge with her across the Atlantic despite losing everything else to the slave traders who captured her. During the brief years before Amara was sold away when Margaret was 8, she had taught her daughter everything she knew about fermentation, about the invisible world of organisms that transformed milk into cheese, about which conditions favored which processes. Those early lessons had given Margaret foundation for expertise she would develop over the next 3 decades. By the time she reached adulthood, Margaret understood cheese-making with sophistication that exceeded what most educated Europeans knew about the process. She could identify different bacterial strains by smell, could predict how cheese would develop based on subtle variations in milk quality and aging conditions, and most importantly, she understood the distinction between bacteria that created delicious, complex flavors and bacteria that created toxins dangerous to human health. The Randolph family had recognized Margaret's exceptional abilities early, assigning her primary responsibility for cheese production when she was just 16. By 1828, when Margaret was 20, the plantation's cheese had developed such reputation that neighboring estates would purchase wheels at premium prices, and Richmond merchants would sell Randolph cheese as luxury product, commanding twice the price of ordinary dairy goods. Master Thomas Randolph, Catherine's husband, took considerable pride in his plantation's dairy reputation, viewing it as evidence of his superior management and refined taste. What Thomas never understood was that the dairy's success had nothing to do with his management, and everything to do with Margaret's inherited knowledge and years of patient experimentation. She had spent 16 years learning which grasses produced milk with which flavors, how seasonal changes affected fermentation, which aging times produced which textures. She had developed techniques for controlling mold growth on cheese surfaces, for adjusting humidity to achieve specific results, for knowing exactly when cheese had reached peak flavor and should be removed from aging. Margaret had married in 1830, choosing a man named Samuel, who worked as a carpenter on the plantation, building and maintaining the structures that housed both enslaved workers and livestock. Their wedding had been a simple ceremony in the slave quarters, followed by permission from Master Randolph to share a cabin near the dairy. Ruth had been born 2 years later, after Margaret had lost 2 earlier infants to fever and breathing problems that killed so many enslaved children in their first years of life. Ruth's survival had felt like blessing, and Margaret had devoted herself to ensuring her daughter would have skills valuable enough to provide some measure of protection within slavery's brutal system. She taught Ruth about cheese-making from earliest childhood, explaining which bacteria created which flavors, how to recognize when fermentation was proceeding correctly, how to handle delicate curds without damaging their structure. By age 10, Ruth could produce cheese that was nearly as good as her mother's, showing natural talent that suggested she might someday exceed Margaret's abilities. Those years working together in the dairy had been among the few genuinely happy periods in Margaret's enslaved life. The work was demanding and the hours were long, but she could at least spend time with her daughter while teaching her skills that might protect her in adulthood. The cool stone aging room became their sanctuary, a place where they could talk quietly while tending cheese wheels, where Ruth could ask questions about the world, and Margaret could share what little wisdom she had accumulated through 36 years of survival under slavery. Catherine Randolph had been born into wealth in Richmond, marrying Thomas when she was 18 and he was 35, a union arranged by families who recognized mutual financial advantage. She had arrived at the plantation with ideas about refinement and sophistication that she attempted to impose on rural Virginia life, hosting tea parties and musical evenings that required elaborate preparations from enslaved houseworkers. Catherine took particular interest in the dairy because its reputation for quality reflected well on her household management skills, and she would often bring guests to tour the facilities while explaining cheese-making processes she didn't actually understand, but had memorized from Margaret's explanations. Over the years, Margaret had learned to manage Catherine's visits and questions with careful deference, explaining techniques in ways that made the mistress feel knowledgeable, while never revealing the deeper expertise that actually drove the dairy's success. Catherine believed she supervised Margaret's work, when in reality, Margaret made every significant decision about production, aging, and quality control. This dynamic, Catherine's illusion of control, masking Margaret's actual authority within the dairy, had functioned smoothly for years, allowing both women to maintain their respective positions within the plantation's hierarchy. But in early 1844, Catherine's attention shifted from dairy operations to mansion aesthetics. She had become obsessed with redecorating the drawing room after visiting a wealthy family in Richmond, whose home featured the latest European fashions. Catherine wanted imported wallpaper with elaborate floral patterns, French furniture upholstered in silk, and crystal chandeliers that would transform her provincial plantation house into something approaching urban elegance. The cost of these improvements was substantial, requiring cash that the plantation's normal operations didn't immediately provide. Thomas Randolph, whose own gambling habits had created periodic financial stress, was reluctant to approve such expensive renovations. The argument between husband and wife extended over several weeks, with Catherine insisting that their social standing required a properly appointed drawing room, and Thomas countering that agricultural investments should take priority over decorative improvements. The compromise they eventually reached involved selling several enslaved workers to raise the necessary funds, with Catherine given authority to select which individuals would be sold based on their current value versus their long-term utility to plantation operations. Catherine chose Ruth for sale, with calculation that was both economically rational and emotionally devastating. The 12-year-old girl was old enough to be valuable to buyers seeking workers who could be trained for skilled positions, but young enough that she hadn't yet developed the full expertise that would make her essential to the Randolph Dairy's operations. Selling Ruth would raise substantial cash, while theoretically leaving Margaret capable of maintaining cheese production without her daughter's assistance. The fact that this decision would permanently destroy Margaret's family was, from Catherine's perspective, an unfortunate but acceptable cost of acquiring the drawing-room furnishings she desired. Margaret learned of the decision in February when Catherine summoned her to the main house to discuss dairy operations. The mistress explained with casual matter-of-factness that Ruth would be sold to a plantation in North Carolina within the week, that the sale had already been arranged with a buyer who specialized in acquiring young enslaved workers for training in domestic and craft positions. Catherine seemed to expect gratitude for selling Ruth to a good situation rather than to field labor or industrial work, apparently believing that this consideration should make the separation more acceptable to Margaret. Margaret maintained her external composure during that conversation, responding with appropriate expressions of submission, while internally experiencing rage so intense it temporarily made breathing difficult. She left Catherine's presence and returned to the dairy, where Ruth was working on aging room maintenance, completely unaware that her life was about to be shattered. Margaret told her daughter what was coming, holding Ruth while the girl cried with the desperate grief of a child who understood she was losing everything, but was too young to fully comprehend the permanence of that loss. The sale occurred 5 days later on a cold March morning, when the buyer arrived with a wagon to collect Ruth and 3 other young enslaved workers Catherine had selected. Margaret was permitted to say goodbye, a brief moment during which she tried to give Ruth advice about surviving in an unfamiliar place among strangers who wouldn't care about her beyond her economic value. Ruth begged her mother to do something, to stop this from happening, her 12-year-old mind unable to accept that adult power was helpless against the system that claimed ownership over their bodies and their future. Margaret watched the wagon depart, carrying her daughter toward a fate she would never know details about, and felt something fundamental break inside her chest. The patient endurance that had sustained her through 36 years of enslavement transformed in those moments into something colder and harder, a determination that Catherine Randolph would pay for this separation with her life. Margaret didn't know yet exactly how she would accomplish that murder, but she knew with absolute certainty that the cheese aging room where she and Ruth had spent so many hours together would become the setting for revenge that would be as slow and methodical as the fermentation processes Margaret had mastered over 16 years of creating dairy products for people who owned her daughter and had just sold that daughter like livestock. The planning began that same evening, conducted in the privacy of the cabin Margaret shared with her husband Samuel, speaking in whispers despite the fact that no one was likely to overhear. Samuel had watched his daughter taken away that morning and understood his wife's grief, because he felt the same devastating loss, though he expressed it through silence and tight-jawed tension rather than through tears. When Margaret told him she intended to kill Catherine Randolph, Samuel didn't try to dissuade her or warn about the catastrophic consequences discovery would bring. He simply asked how she planned to accomplish it and what he could do to help. Margaret explained that the method had to be subtle enough to appear natural, patient enough to avoid arousing suspicion, and selective enough to affect only Catherine while leaving everyone else in the household safe. Direct poisoning through food would be too obvious and too difficult to control. Too many people handled the food that went to the main house, and creating selective contamination that affected only one person would be nearly impossible with prepared meals. But cheese offered different possibilities because Margaret controlled every aspect of its production and aging, and because Catherine had a specific ritual that provided the delivery system Margaret needed. Every morning for years, Catherine had eaten the same breakfast in her private sitting room, fresh bread with butter and a slice of aged cheese that she insisted aided her digestion and maintained her refined figure. This daily cheese consumption was based on contemporary medical theories about fermented foods, beliefs that Catherine followed with the rigid adherence of someone who viewed health practices as markers of social sophistication. The cheese came from wheels Margaret selected specifically for the mistress's consumption, usually varieties aged for 6 to 8 months, that had developed complex flavors Catherine particularly enjoyed. That breakfast ritual would become the delivery system for Catherine's death if Margaret could contaminate specific cheese wheels with bacterial cultures that would create toxins accumulating in the body over time when consumed regularly. The challenge was identifying which bacteria would produce the desired effect: illness, severe enough to kill, but slow enough to appear as natural wasting disease rather than acute food poisoning. Margaret needed something that would take months to accomplish its work, giving her time to ensure her own safety before the mistress died. The knowledge Margaret required came partly from her mother's teachings and partly from her own observations over 16 years of dairy work. Amara had taught her daughter about the difference between beneficial bacteria that created flavors and texture in cheese and harmful bacteria that created toxins dangerous to consume. Most importantly, Amara had explained that some bacterial toxins accumulated in the body over time, causing progressive damage that wouldn't manifest immediately, but that would eventually lead to organ failure if consumption continued long enough. Margaret had witnessed this principle in action several times during her dairy career, though usually in contexts where the contamination had been accidental rather than deliberate. She remembered an incident 5 years earlier when several plantation workers had become ill after eating cheese that had been aged under improper conditions, allowing harmful bacteria to proliferate despite the cheese appearing and tasting normal. The workers had experienced stomach problems, weakness, and other symptoms that had persisted for weeks before gradually resolving once they stopped eating the contaminated cheese. One older man had died from complications, his organs too weakened by accumulated toxins to recover even after the contaminated food was removed from his diet. That incident had taught Margaret several important lessons about how bacterial contamination could create progressive illness rather than immediate acute symptoms. She had studied the failed cheese carefully, identifying the specific conditions that had allowed harmful bacteria to outcompete beneficial ones during aging. She had noted the distinctive smell that developed in contaminated cheese, a subtle sourness that was barely noticeable unless you knew what to detect. Most importantly, she had observed how long the illness persisted and how much contaminated cheese had been consumed before symptoms appeared. Armed with this knowledge and these observations, Margaret began planning how to deliberately create the conditions that would produce deadly bacterial contamination in specific cheese wheels intended for Catherine's consumption. The process would require months of preparation because cheese took time to age, and because the contamination needed to be subtle enough to escape notice during that aging period. Margaret would need to start new wheels specifically for this purpose, introducing harmful bacteria at the beginning of fermentation, and then monitoring their development through the aging process to ensure they created the desired toxins without producing obvious spoilage that would make the cheese inedible. The first step was obtaining the bacterial cultures Margaret needed to contaminate the cheese. These cultures existed naturally in the environment, particularly in dairy environments where countless microorganisms competed for resources. Margaret identified several sources where harmful bacteria could be found: standing water in the dairy's drainage system, milk that had been allowed to sour under warm conditions, cheese that had failed quality checks and been set aside for disposal. She collected samples from these sources over the following weeks, storing them in small ceramic containers hidden in the aging room where no one would think to look for them. The second step was preparing milk specifically for contamination. Margaret selected milk from cows that were producing lower quality product, liquid that would normally be used for butter or sold to workers' families, rather than reserved for premium cheese production. This milk would become the base for Catherine's deadly breakfast cheese, contaminated from the moment fermentation began. Margaret added her bacterial cultures to the milk before introducing the rennet that would cause it to form curds, ensuring that harmful organisms were present throughout the fermentation process and would multiply as the cheese aged. The third step was creating aging conditions that would favor the harmful bacteria, rather than suppressing them in favor of beneficial organisms. Normally, Margaret controlled aging room temperature and humidity precisely to encourage the development of flavors while preventing spoilage. But for Catherine's cheese, Margaret deliberately created slightly warmer and more humid conditions in one section of the aging room, conditions that would allow harmful bacteria to thrive while still producing cheese that appeared and tasted acceptable to someone who wasn't trained to detect subtle problems. Over April and early May, Margaret prepared 4 wheels of contaminated cheese, each one carefully marked with a small notch on the edge that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it, but that allowed Margaret to identify which wheels were intended for Catherine's consumption. These wheels aged alongside dozens of normal wheels, looking nearly identical, but containing bacterial cultures that were slowly producing toxins that would accumulate in the body of anyone who ate the cheese regularly over an extended period. By late May, the first contaminated wheel had aged for approximately 8 weeks, reaching a point where Margaret judged it ready for initial testing. She couldn't risk consuming the cheese herself to verify its properties, but she could assess it through smell and visual inspection, using her expertise to determine whether the bacterial cultures had developed as intended. The cheese smelled almost normal, with only the faintest hint of the sourness that indicated harmful bacteria were present. The texture appeared correct, firm, but not too hard, with the slightly crumbly consistency Catherine preferred in aged cheese. Most importantly, the contamination wasn't obvious enough to make anyone question whether the cheese was safe to eat. Margaret brought the first contaminated wheel to the main house kitchen in early June, presenting it to the cook as a new batch ready for the mistress's breakfast service. The cook, an older enslaved woman named Betty, who had worked in the Randolph kitchen for 30 years, accepted the cheese without question, trusting Margaret's judgment about which products were appropriate for the mistress's consumption. Betty sliced the cheese according to Catherine's specific preferences, thin enough to be elegant but thick enough to provide substantial taste, and served it at breakfast the following morning, alongside the fresh bread and butter that completed the mistress's daily ritual. Catherine ate her breakfast as usual, apparently noticing nothing unusual about the cheese beyond perhaps a slightly more complex flavor that she might have attributed to Margaret's continuing refinement of aging techniques. She made no complaint, provided no indication that anything was wrong with the dairy products she consumed. For Margaret, who spent that entire day in anxious anticipation of discovery, Catherine's silence was both relief and confirmation that the contamination was subtle enough to escape detection through taste alone. The daily breakfast deliveries continued through June, with Margaret rotating between contaminated wheels as each one was consumed and needed replacement. She maintained careful records in her memory about which wheels were intended for Catherine and which were destined for other purposes, ensuring that no one else would accidentally consume the poisoned cheese. The normal production continued alongside the deadly preparation, with Margaret producing the same high-quality cheese that had built the dairy's reputation, while simultaneously creating products designed to kill the woman who had stolen her daughter. Samuel watched his wife work through those weeks with mixture of concern and quiet support. He understood the enormous risk Margaret was taking, knew that discovery would mean death by torture, designed to serve as example to other enslaved workers who might contemplate resistance. But he also understood that some violations were so profound that accepting them without response meant accepting complete destruction of whatever humanity enslaved people could maintain, despite the system's efforts to reduce them to property. Catherine had sold Ruth with casual indifference to the devastation that separation caused, viewing a child's life as nothing more than currency to purchase wallpaper and furniture. That action had earned Catherine a death sentence delivered through contaminated cheese, and Samuel wouldn't interfere with his wife's careful execution of that sentence. By early July, Catherine began experiencing the first subtle symptoms of the poisoning Margaret had engineered. The mistress complained of occasional stomach discomfort, attributing it to the summer heat, or to minor dietary indiscretions, rather than to systematic contamination of the cheese she ate every morning. The symptoms were mild enough that Catherine didn't consult a physician, instead treating herself with the various tonics and remedies that wealthy women of her era collected in their medicine cabinets. These self-administered treatments did nothing to address the actual problem, which was cumulative bacterial toxins that were slowly damaging Catherine's digestive organs and liver. Margaret observed these early symptoms with careful attention, monitoring Catherine's condition through reports from house servants who mentioned the mistress's complaints during their interactions with dairy workers. The progression was slower than Margaret had initially hoped, suggesting she might need to increase the concentration of harmful bacteria in subsequent cheese wheels to ensure Catherine's decline would be fatal rather than merely debilitating. Margaret adjusted her contamination process accordingly, introducing slightly higher levels of bacterial cultures into the cheese wheels she prepared in mid-July for consumption later in the summer. The aging room remained Margaret's sanctuary and laboratory throughout this period, the cool stone chamber where she conducted experiments in fermentation that would have impressed trained scientists if they had known what she was accomplishing. Margaret spent hours each day in that room, tending both normal cheese wheels and the special contaminated ones intended for Catherine. She monitored temperature and humidity with precision, adjusted ventilation to create optimal conditions for different bacterial strains, and rotated wheels to ensure even aging that would make the contaminated cheese indistinguishable from safe products, except through sophisticated chemical analysis that wouldn't be conducted in 1844 Virginia. The isolation of the aging room, and Catherine's insistence that only Margaret should handle the cheese, created perfect conditions for undetected murder. No one supervised Margaret's work closely enough to notice subtle differences in how she treated certain wheels. No one questioned her judgments about which cheese was ready for consumption and which needed additional aging. The trust that the Randolph family had placed in Margaret's expertise over 16 years had created blind spot that allowed her to transform that expertise into a weapon they would never see coming until far too late to defend against it. By the end of July, Catherine's symptoms had progressed beyond occasional discomfort into more persistent problems that began to concern her enough to mention them to her husband. Thomas Randolph suggested consulting their family physician if the problems continued, but Catherine was reluctant to admit to illness that might suggest weakness or lack of the refinement she prided herself on maintaining. She continued eating her daily breakfast cheese, each slice bringing more accumulated toxins into a body whose organs were beginning to show signs of stress from processing substances they weren't designed to handle in such quantities. August brought intensification of Catherine's symptoms that could no longer be dismissed as minor digestive upset or temporary indisposition. The mistress experienced persistent nausea that made eating difficult, fatigue so profound that she struggled to complete her normal daily activities, and stomach pain that grew increasingly severe despite the various remedies she attempted. Her skin began taking on a grayish pallor that alarmed the house servants who saw her daily, and she lost weight at a rate that made her fashionable dresses hang loosely on a frame that had always been carefully maintained through diet and corseting. Thomas Randolph finally insisted on summoning Dr. Edward Harrison from the nearby town, a physician who had attended the family for years and who represented the best medical knowledge available in rural Virginia. Harrison arrived in mid-August and conducted a thorough examination, asking Catherine detailed questions about her symptoms, their onset, and any changes in her daily routine that might explain her decline. Catherine described the stomach problems, the fatigue, the progressive weakness that seemed to worsen week by week despite her efforts to rest and take nourishing food. Dr. Harrison's diagnosis reflected the medical understanding of 1844, which attributed most mysterious illnesses to imbalances in bodily humors or to miasmas from unhealthy environments. He concluded that Catherine suffered from a digestive disorder, possibly caused by the summer heat, combined with some constitutional weakness that had made her vulnerable to illness. His prescribed treatment included bloodletting to rebalance her humors, various tonics containing mercury and other substances believed to have medicinal properties, and complete bed rest to allow her body to recover its natural equilibrium. Margaret learned of this diagnosis through the network of enslaved house servants who shared information about events in the main house, and she understood with grim satisfaction that the doctor's treatments would actually worsen Catherine's condition rather than improving it. Bloodletting would weaken an already compromised body, while mercury compounds would add their own toxicity to the bacterial toxins Margaret was introducing through contaminated cheese. The physician's well-intentioned efforts would accelerate Catherine's decline while providing cover for the true cause of her illness. Through late August and into September, Catherine's condition continued deteriorating, despite following Dr. Harrison's recommendations faithfully. The bloodletting sessions left her pale and weak. The mercury tonics caused additional stomach distress, and the bed rest meant she spent most of her time in her private chambers, consuming the breakfast cheese that Margaret continued delivering through the kitchen. Each morning, Betty would bring a tray to Catherine's room containing bread, butter, and sliced cheese from Wheels Margaret had specifically prepared for this purpose, and each morning Catherine would eat that cheese, believing it was nourishing food rather than the delivery system for her death. The house servants who attended Catherine during her illness reported to other enslaved workers that the mistress was suffering greatly, that she had become irritable and demanding in ways that exceeded her normal imperious behavior. Catherine would complain constantly about her symptoms, would blame servants for imagined failures in their care, and would demand treatments and remedies that provided no relief from the progressive organ failure that bacterial toxins were causing. The servants endured these complaints with practiced patience, understanding that illness made people difficult, but also recognizing that Catherine's cruelty toward enslaved workers had earned her little sympathy, even from those who were forced to tend her during her decline. Margaret maintained her normal dairy routine throughout this period, producing the same high-quality cheese that had built the plantation's reputation while simultaneously monitoring Catherine's progression toward death. She felt no guilt about what she was doing, only grim satisfaction that justice was being served for Ruth's sale and for the countless other cruelties Catherine had inflicted during her years as plantation mistress. The image of Ruth's tearful face as the wagon carried her away sustained Margaret through any moments when doubt threatened to undermine her determination. Catherine had stolen Margaret's daughter to purchase decorative wallpaper, viewing a child's life as nothing more than currency for home improvement. That calculation had earned Catherine a death that was slow, painful, and disguised as natural illness in ways that would protect Margaret from discovery. By early September, Catherine's condition had deteriorated to the point where Dr. Harrison admitted his treatments weren't producing the expected improvement. He consulted medical texts and conferred with colleagues in Richmond, seeking explanations for an illness that seemed to worsen despite interventions that should have restored the patient's health. The consensus among physicians was that Catherine suffered from a wasting disease of unknown origin, possibly related to some constitutional weakness that made her vulnerable to progressive organ failure. Thomas Randolph, desperate to save his wife despite their often contentious relationship, summoned additional medical expertise in the form of Dr. William Chester from Richmond, a younger physician who had studied at medical school in Philadelphia, and who brought more current knowledge than the rural practitioners who had been treating Catherine. Chester arrived in mid-September and conducted extensive examination, testing Catherine's urine for signs of kidney disease and examining her abdomen for evidence of growths or other abnormalities that might explain her symptoms. Chester's more sophisticated medical training allowed him to recognize that Catherine's symptoms suggested systemic poisoning rather than simple digestive disorder. But the limitations of 1844 medical knowledge meant he couldn't identify the specific toxin or its source. He questioned Catherine extensively about what she ate and drank, but Catherine's descriptions of her simple breakfast ritual bread, butter and cheese that she had consumed daily for years without problem seemed to rule out food contamination as explanation. Chester had no reason to suspect that cheese made by a trusted enslaved worker might be deliberately contaminated with bacterial cultures designed to kill slowly over months, rather than causing acute illness within hours. The physician's inability to identify the cause of Catherine's illness or to provide effective treatment created an atmosphere of helpless frustration in the Randolph household. Thomas watched his wife waste away despite the best medical care available, unable to understand why someone who had been healthy 4 months earlier was now clearly dying. The house servants maintained their duties while privately discussing whether Catherine's illness might be divine punishment for the cruelties she had inflicted on enslaved people throughout her years as mistress. Margaret continued her dairy work with careful normalcy, ensuring that nothing in her behavior would suggest she possessed knowledge about Catherine's condition that no one else had. Through late September, Catherine's symptoms evolved in ways that confirmed to Margaret that the bacterial poisoning was reaching its final stages. The mistress experienced episodes of confusion and disorientation as toxins began affecting her brain function, her weakened body struggling to process the accumulated contamination that months of daily cheese consumption had introduced into her system. She would sometimes fail to recognize servants she had known for years, or would give contradictory instructions that reflected deteriorating mental clarity. Her skin took on a yellowish tinge that suggested her liver was failing, unable to filter the poisons that were overwhelming her body's natural defenses. Dr. Chester remained baffled by the case, his Philadelphia medical training insufficient to explain an illness that progressed so relentlessly despite every intervention he attempted. He prescribed various treatments based on his best understanding of the symptoms, but nothing he tried produced meaningful improvement in Catherine's condition. The physician's frustration was evident in his conversations with Thomas, admitting that he had never encountered a case quite like this one, and that medical science in 1844 simply lacked the knowledge necessary to identify or treat whatever was destroying Catherine's health. Margaret observed these medical consultations from her position at the dairy, receiving reports through the network of enslaved workers who moved between different areas of the plantation. She understood that the physician's bafflement was actually confirmation of her success. If trained doctors with access to medical texts and consultation with colleagues couldn't identify bacterial poisoning delivered through contaminated cheese, then no investigation would ever trace Catherine's death back to deliberate action by the enslaved woman who controlled the dairy operations. The contaminated cheese wheels Margaret had prepared in July were nearly exhausted by late September, consumed slice by slice over months of Catherine's daily breakfast ritual. Margaret prepared one final wheel using the same contamination techniques she had refined over the previous months, understanding that this would likely be the last cheese Catherine would ever eat. The mistress's decline had progressed to the point where death was clearly approaching, whether from accumulated bacterial toxins or from the combined effects of those toxins and the harmful medical treatments Catherine had received. Samuel watched his wife work through those final weeks with quiet understanding of what she had accomplished. Margaret had transformed her expertise in fermentation into a weapon that had killed their daughter's cellar while leaving no evidence that would endanger Margaret herself. The method had required patience that exceeded what most people could maintain, discipline that allowed her to continue appearing as the loyal dairy worker while systematically poisoning her mistress, and knowledge that no one suspected an enslaved woman of possessing. Samuel felt pride mixed with sorrow as he observed Margaret's careful execution of justice for Ruth's sale, understanding that this achievement came at cost of bearing knowledge about murder that could never be openly acknowledged or discussed. The drawing room that Catherine had sold Ruth to finance stood completed by late September, the imported wallpaper installed, and the French furniture arranged according to the mistress's detailed specifications. Catherine had been too ill to properly enjoy the room since its completion, managing only brief visits before her weakness forced her back to bed. The elaborate redecoration that had cost Ruth her freedom and her mother became monument to Catherine's vanity and cruelty, a room that would outlast the woman who had sacrificed a child's life to create it. Other enslaved workers on the plantation had begun to suspect that Catherine's illness might not be entirely natural, though none of them possessed specific knowledge about what Margaret had done or how she had accomplished it. The timing of Catherine's decline following Ruth's sale was suggestive to people who understood that enslaved workers sometimes found ways to resist their oppressors despite overwhelming power differentials. Quiet conversations in the quarters included speculation about whether the mistress's illness represented divine justice or human intervention, with most workers careful not to voice explicit accusations that might endanger Margaret if overheard by white listeners. Margaret herself maintained perfect external composure throughout Catherine's final weeks, continuing her dairy work with the same careful attention to quality that had characterized her 16 years of service. She delivered cheese to the main house kitchen without any change in her demeanor, spoke respectfully to white overseers and family members when their paths crossed, and gave no indication that she possessed guilty knowledge about the mistress's mysterious illness. The mask of submission that enslaved people wore to survive was so deeply ingrained in Margaret's behavior that even people who knew her well couldn't detect whether she felt satisfaction or concern about Catherine's approaching death. By the final week of September, Catherine had declined to the point where Dr. Chester acknowledged that death was imminent and that nothing more could be done medically to save her. The physician recommended keeping her comfortable during her final days, administering laudanum to ease pain, and allowing family members to say their farewells. Thomas Randolph sat with his wife during those last days, their marriage's conflicts temporarily set aside in the face of her approaching death. Catherine's parents traveled from Richmond to be present, arriving in time to spend a few hours with their daughter before she became too confused to recognize them. Catherine Randolph died on October 3rd, 4 months after Margaret had begun delivering contaminated cheese to her breakfast table. The immediate cause of death was recorded as organ failure resulting from a wasting disease of unknown origin, with no indication in any medical record that bacterial poisoning might have been involved. Dr. Chester signed the death certificate with notation that he had treated the patient for progressive illness that had proven resistant to all therapeutic interventions, his medical reputation unblemished by his failure to identify the true cause of Catherine's death. The funeral was held 3 days later, a modest affair attended by neighboring plantation families and local officials, who paid respects to a woman who had been known for her refined taste and social ambitions. The minister delivering the eulogy praised Catherine's efforts to bring culture and elegance to rural Virginia life, making no mention of the cruelties she had inflicted on the enslaved people who had made that cultured lifestyle possible. Margaret stood among the other enslaved workers during the service, her expression appropriately somber for the loss of a mistress, her thoughts carefully hidden behind the mask she had worn for 36 years of survival under slavery. The weeks following Catherine's death brought significant changes to the Randolph plantation's operations and to the circumstances of the enslaved workers who had served the household for years. Thomas Randolph, now a widower at 47, found himself managing an estate without the wife who had handled many of the domestic operations he had largely ignored. He relied heavily on the enslaved workers who had made the household function smoothly, particularly those in positions of authority over specific operations like Margaret's management of the dairy. Thomas summoned Margaret to the main house study in late October for a conversation about the dairy's future operations. The master sat behind his desk, looking older and more worn than he had before Catherine's illness, the stress of watching his wife waste away having taken visible toll. He explained that he intended to maintain the dairy operations at their current level despite Catherine's death, recognizing that the cheese production represented significant income for the plantation. He asked Margaret whether she could continue managing the dairy without Catherine's supervision, a question that would have been almost comical if the circumstances had been different, since Margaret had never actually received meaningful supervision from the mistress who claimed to oversee her work. "I can continue the dairy operations as before, Master Randolph," Margaret assured him with appropriate deference. "Miss Catherine's guidance was valuable, but the work itself follows patterns I've learned over many years. The careful fiction that Catherine had provided meaningful oversight was maintained even in her absence, both master and enslaved worker understanding their respective roles in the plantation's social hierarchy required such diplomatic language." Thomas seemed relieved by Margaret's assurance, having worried that losing Catherine might disrupt dairy operations that generated substantial revenue. He mentioned that several neighboring plantation owners had already inquired about purchasing Randolph cheese for the coming season, orders that would require maintaining production at levels Margaret had achieved in previous years. The master's primary concern was economic continuity rather than any genuine interest in the welfare of the enslaved woman whose expertise made that continuity possible. As Margaret prepared to leave the study, Thomas made an observation that caused ice to form in her stomach, despite her careful external composure. "It's unfortunate that Miss Catherine's illness began around the same time we made those sales earlier this year," he said, his tone suggesting no particular suspicion, but rather an idle connection of events that had occurred during a difficult period. The upset of those business transactions may have affected her constitution more than we realized at the time. She did take such matters very personally. Margaret murmured appropriate agreement while understanding that Thomas had just voiced a connection between Ruth's sale and Catherine's subsequent illness, even if he interpreted that connection as emotional stress rather than as deliberate poisoning. The comment suggested that any future investigation might examine the timing of events more carefully, though Margaret believed that ship had sailed with Catherine's burial and the death certificate that attributed her demise to natural causes. The dairy operations continued through the fall and winter of 1844, with Margaret producing the same high-quality cheese that had built the plantation's reputation. She carefully destroyed the contaminated wheels that remained from her months of poisoning Catherine, disposing of them in ways that ensured no one else would consume cheese that still contained dangerous bacterial cultures. The aging room returned to producing only safe products, Margaret's expertise now directed entirely toward legitimate fermentation rather than toward the deadly contamination she had practiced for 4 months. Other enslaved workers on the plantation treated Margaret with subtle shift in attitude following Catherine's death, a barely perceptible change in how they interacted with the dairy woman who had lost her daughter and whose mistress had subsequently died under mysterious circumstances. No one spoke openly about suspicions that Margaret might have been responsible for Catherine's illness. Understanding that such accusations would endanger Margaret and potentially bring investigation that could expose resistance activities that went beyond what she had done. But conversations in the quarters included veiled references to the power possessed by people who controlled what others consumed, lessons learned from recent events that wouldn't be forgotten or wasted. Samuel remained Margaret's closest confidant and supporter through those months, the only person who knew with certainty what his wife had done and how she had accomplished it. The couple would sometimes discuss their missing daughter during evening hours in their cabin, wondering whether Ruth had survived her first months at the North Carolina plantation and whether they would ever receive any information about her circumstances. Those conversations were marked by grief that would never fully heal, the permanent separation inflicted by Catherine's decision to sell Ruth in exchange for decorative wallpaper. In early 1845, Thomas Randolph made a decision that significantly altered Margaret's circumstances and that suggested he might harbor suspicions about his wife's death, despite never voicing them explicitly. He announced that he intended to grant manumission to several enslaved workers who had provided exceptional service over many years, including Margaret, Samuel, and a few others who held positions of particular responsibility or skill. The official explanation was that Thomas was honoring his late wife's wishes regarding workers she had particularly valued, though no written record of such wishes existed, and Catherine had never expressed any interest in manumission during her lifetime. Margaret understood that Thomas's decision likely reflected some level of suspicion about Catherine's death, combined with desire to remove from the plantation anyone who might have been involved, while also rewarding valuable workers whose skills he wanted to acknowledge before they could no longer benefit from such recognition. Granting manumission allowed Thomas to appear generous while actually protecting himself from potential danger posed by enslaved workers who possessed knowledge and expertise that could be weaponized if circumstances pushed them toward resistance. The manumission papers were drawn up by a lawyer from Richmond and filed with the county clerk in March 1845, legally establishing Margaret Foster, Samuel Foster, and several others as free people of color under Virginia law. The documents came with the standard restrictions. The freed individuals had to leave Virginia within 12 months, as state law prohibited free black people from residing in the state beyond that grace period. But those restrictions were minor compared to the transformation the papers represented, freedom purchased not through Catherine's generosity, as Thomas claimed, but through Margaret's patient execution of justice for her daughter's sale. The manumission created complex reactions among the other enslaved workers, who remained in bondage while Margaret and a few others received freedom. Some expressed genuine happiness for Margaret's liberation, viewing it as a rare stroke of fortune in a system that rarely provided such outcomes. Others showed resentment that Margaret had secured freedom while they continued suffering under slavery, though most understood enough about recent events to recognize that freedom had been earned through actions they could only whisper about in the most private conversations. A few of the older workers approached Margaret quietly to ask oblique questions about Catherine's death, and about whether certain knowledge might have played a role in securing manumission, but Margaret maintained careful ambiguity in her responses, neither confirming nor denying what perceptive people could already guess. The story of Margaret and the contaminated cheese began spreading through enslaved communities across Virginia and into neighboring states almost immediately, carried by the invisible communication networks that connected black workers despite the distances and restrictions meant to isolate them. The details transformed with each retelling, some versions emphasizing Margaret's African knowledge as mystical power rather than as scientific expertise, others focusing on the justice of a mother avenging her daughter's sale through the food she prepared for the woman who had destroyed her family. Still others told the story more plainly as example of how specialized knowledge acquired through forced labor could be turned back against the system that demanded that expertise, while denying the humanity of those who possessed it. These varying narratives served important purposes for enslaved people who heard them. They provided examples of resistance and agency in a system designed to crush both, offering hope that oppression could be challenged through intelligence and planning, even when direct confrontation meant certain death. The stories conveyed practical information about how control over food preparation, fermentation, and other household processes could become power when circumstances demanded action that the law would never sanction. Young women learning domestic crafts heard Margaret's story and understood that the skills they were acquiring possessed dimensions beyond simple labor. That knowledge itself was a form of power that couldn't be entirely controlled by those who claimed to own the people who possessed it. Margaret spent her remaining months on the Randolph plantation, training a younger enslaved woman named Celia to take over dairy operations after Margaret's departure. The training was thorough and professional, Margaret teaching Celia the legitimate aspects of cheese-making while carefully avoiding any discussion of the deadly applications that fermentation knowledge could serve. Celia was competent and attentive, showing aptitude for the work that suggested the dairy's reputation would be maintained even after Margaret left. But Celia would never possess the depth of understanding about bacterial cultures and fermentation that Margaret had inherited from her African mother and refined through 16 years of practice, knowledge that had proven deadly in Catherine Randolph's case. Thomas Randolph treated Margaret with careful courtesy during those final months, maintaining appropriate master-servant formality while also showing awareness that the woman he had enslaved for decades was soon to be legally free and beyond his direct control. He made arrangements for Margaret and Samuel to receive small payments for their years of service, modest sums that were technically illegal under slavery, but that Thomas provided anyway as combination of genuine gratitude and insurance against any future revelations about what might have caused his wife's death. The money wasn't substantial, but it provided foundation for Margaret and Samuel to begin their lives as free people with some minimal financial cushion. As Margaret's departure date approached in early 1846, she made a final visit to the cheese aging room that had been her domain for 16 years, and that had served as the laboratory where she had transformed dairy expertise into the weapon that killed Catherine Randolph. The cool stone chamber held dozens of wheels of cheese at various stages of aging, products that would be consumed by people who would never know that this same room had once housed contaminated wheels specifically designed to deliver death through breakfast ritual. Margaret walked among the shelves, touching wheels she had prepared, and aged with care that exceeded what slavery should have been able to command, understanding that her legacy would include both the exceptional cheese that had built the dairy's reputation and the perfect murder that had avenged her daughter's sale. The couple departed the Randolph plantation in March 1846, traveling north along routes established by networks that helped formerly enslaved people relocate to states where their free status would be more secure and where the restrictions on free black people were less severe than in Virginia. They carried their manumission papers carefully protected in oilcloth, understanding that those documents were precious beyond measure in a society where black people were presumed enslaved unless they could prove otherwise. The papers offered protection from slave catchers and gave them legal standing to work, own property, and move freely within the considerable restrictions that still applied to free black people, even in northern states. Margaret and Samuel settled eventually in Philadelphia, where a substantial free black community offered both economic opportunities and relative safety from the kidnapping and fraudulent re-enslavement that remained constant dangers for free black people throughout the antebellum period. Margaret found work with a commercial dairy that was beginning to supply the city's growing population, applying her cheese-making skills in a context where she received wages for expertise that had previously generated profit only for white owners who claimed to own her body and her labor. The pay was modest compared to what white dairy workers commanded, but it was more money than Margaret had ever controlled in her life, and it belonged to her to spend as she chose. Samuel established himself as a carpenter, building and repairing structures for both black and white customers who valued his skills, even if they wouldn't have socialized with him. The couple built a life in Philadelphia that would have been impossible in Virginia, participating in the city's free black community and contributing to networks that helped other formerly enslaved people establish themselves after escaping bondage. They never had news of Ruth, never learned whether their daughter had survived her first years at the North Carolina plantation or had died like so many young enslaved people forced into brutal labor conditions. That uncertainty haunted them both, a permanent wound that freedom couldn't heal because it had been inflicted before liberation came too late to prevent the separation that had destroyed their family. Margaret Foster lived to age 53, dying in 1861 as the nation descended into civil war that would eventually end the slavery system that had claimed most of her life. Her death came from pneumonia during a harsh Philadelphia winter, an illness her body couldn't fight off despite the medical care available to free black residents of the city. Samuel was with her during her final hours, holding her hand while she drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally speaking Ruth's name as if her daughter might somehow be present, despite the 17 years that had passed since they had seen each other. Margaret's funeral was attended by more than 70 people, including family members, fellow workers from the dairy where she had spent 15 years creating cheese as a free woman, and members of the free black community who had known her as a quiet, dignified person whose past remained partially mysterious despite years of residence in Philadelphia. The eulogy praised her expertise with fermentation and her dedication to teaching younger workers the craft of cheese-making, making only brief reference to her years in slavery and saying nothing specific about the circumstances that had led to her liberation. But among those who attended Margaret's funeral were several people who knew the fuller story, who had heard whispered accounts of the mistress who died from mysterious wasting illness and the dairy woman who had gained freedom shortly afterward. These individuals understood that Margaret Foster represented something important in the history of resistance against slavery, an example of how specialized knowledge and trusted access to food preparation could be transformed into weapons when circumstances demanded action that no legal system would ever sanction or support. Samuel lived another 12 years after Margaret's death, working as a carpenter until his health failed in 1873. He never remarried, choosing instead to focus on his work and on maintaining connections with the extended community of formerly enslaved people who had built lives in Philadelphia. Before his death, Samuel gave an interview to a researcher documenting formerly enslaved people's experiences, speaking carefully about his and Margaret's years on the Randolph plantation. When asked specifically about Catherine Randolph's death, Samuel paused for a long moment before responding with characteristic ambiguity. "My wife was the finest cheesemaker in Virginia," he said finally. "She understood fermentation better than any educated scientist, knew which bacteria created which results, could control aging conditions with precision that white dairy workers couldn't match. That knowledge made her valuable to the people who claimed to own us, but it also gave her power they never suspected she possessed. Sometimes knowledge like that becomes the only justice available to people the law won't protect." The statement was masterfully evasive, capable of being interpreted as either general observation about specialized expertise or veiled admission that Margaret had used her knowledge to kill the woman who sold their daughter. The physical site where the Randolph plantation once stood exists today as part of a much larger agricultural operation, the property having been subdivided and sold multiple times over the 180 years since Margaret's departure. The original dairy complex was destroyed during the Civil War, burned by Union forces moving through Virginia in 1864, and was never rebuilt. The stone aging room where Margaret had cultivated both exceptional cheese and deadly bacterial cultures was demolished sometime in the late 19th century, its stones repurposed for other construction projects. No visible trace remains of the chamber that served as laboratory for one of slavery's most sophisticated murders. Local historians who study the region's antebellum period occasionally mention the Randolph estate in their research, usually in the context of discussing dairy farming or the economics of specialized agricultural production. Catherine Randolph's death from mysterious wasting illness in 1844 appears in these histories as a footnote, sometimes accompanied by speculation about whether the illness might have been related to environmental factors or dietary deficiencies common in that era. None of these historical accounts seriously consider the possibility that Catherine was murdered by her own enslaved dairywoman through months of patient contamination, because such speculation would require acknowledging that enslaved people possessed both the intelligence and the agency to commit such sophisticated crimes. This historical blindness reflects broader patterns in how slavery has been remembered and recorded. The dominant narratives have emphasized enslaved people's suffering and their eventual liberation through political processes controlled largely by white actors, while paying less attention to the countless ways enslaved people themselves resisted, survived, and sometimes struck back against their oppressors. Margaret Foster's story exists in the gaps of official history, preserved through oral tradition and family memory rather than through documents that contemporary white society would have considered authoritative. The legend of Margaret and the contaminated cheese continued circulating through black communities well into the 20th century, though the details evolved and changed with each generation's retelling. Some versions emphasized the African knowledge Margaret's mother had passed down, presenting it as mystical wisdom that transcended European scientific understanding. Others focused on the technical sophistication of Margaret's method, describing her as self-taught microbiologist who had mastered fermentation chemistry decades before that science was formally established. Still others interpreted the story metaphorically, viewing it as parable about how patience and specialized knowledge could overcome seemingly insurmountable power differentials. All these versions, regardless of their specific details, served similar purposes for the communities that preserved them. They provided examples of resistance and agency in a historical period when black Americans were systematically denied both. They offered evidence that enslaved people had been active participants in their own liberation rather than passive victims waiting for white saviors to free them. And they conveyed practical information about how specialized knowledge could serve purposes beyond those intended by the people who forced enslaved workers to acquire that expertise. The Foster family maintained their connection to Margaret's legacy across multiple generations, though they were careful about how much detail they shared with outsiders about the circumstances that had led to their ancestors' freedom. Family gatherings would sometimes include stories about the grandmother or great-grandmother who had been the finest cheesemaker in Virginia before gaining liberation and relocating to Philadelphia. Older family members would emphasize Margaret's intelligence and her dedication to family, occasionally adding cryptic comments about how she had used her knowledge to protect the people she loved and to achieve justice when the legal system offered none. Younger generations understood that there was more to these stories than what was explicitly stated, but the family's tradition of careful ambiguity meant that full details were never openly discussed, even within the family itself. This pattern of selective disclosure reflected the ongoing dangers that black Americans faced even after slavery's formal end. During the Jim Crow era and beyond, when racial violence and systematic oppression created conditions that in many ways resembled slavery without its legal framework, stories about enslaved people killing their masters could be interpreted as incitement to violence against white people or as evidence that black Americans posed inherent threats to social order. Families like the Fosters understood that preserving their ancestors' story required maintaining the same ambiguity that Margaret herself had cultivated, never quite confirming or denying the truth about Catherine Randolph's death, even among themselves. The knowledge was passed down through careful hints and oblique references rather than through explicit statements, ensuring that each generation understood the essence of what Margaret had done without possessing details that could be used against them if hostile authorities demanded information. The broader significance of Margaret Foster's story lies in how it challenges simplified narratives about slavery and resistance. Popular understanding of resistance often focuses on dramatic escapes along the Underground Railroad, armed rebellions like Nat Turner's uprising, or the political movements that eventually led to emancipation. These forms of resistance were certainly important and required tremendous courage from the people who participated in them. But they represented only one dimension of how enslaved people fought against their oppression. Margaret's story illustrates a quieter but equally significant form of resistance, the strategic use of specialized knowledge to achieve outcomes that direct confrontation could never accomplish. This type of resistance required patience that exceeded what most people could maintain, maintaining submissive appearance for years or even decades while waiting for the right moment to act. It demanded sophisticated understanding of systems and people, recognizing patterns and vulnerabilities that could be exploited when circumstances finally provided both motive and opportunity. And it necessitated willingness to accept enormous personal risk, understanding that any discovery would result in consequences far worse than continued endurance of oppression. The cheese-aging room that had been Margaret's domain represented the paradox at the heart of slavery. Enslavers depended absolutely on the labor and expertise of people they brutally oppressed, creating relationships characterized by simultaneous trust and terror, intimacy and violence. Catherine Randolph had trusted Margaret to produce the cheese that sustained the household and generated income for the plantation, never suspecting that the enslaved woman she depended on possessed knowledge, sophisticated enough to turn fermentation into murder and patience enough to execute that murder over months without ever arousing suspicion. This dependence on enslaved expertise created vulnerabilities that some enslaved people, like Margaret, learned to exploit when circumstances pushed them beyond the breaking point where survival required action rather than endurance. The system's economic logic demanded that enslaved workers acquire specialized skills that made them valuable, but that same specialized knowledge could become dangerous when possessed by people who had every reason to harbor rage against those who claimed to own them. Margaret's willingness to destroy Catherine through contaminated cheese demonstrates the depth of rage that Ruth's sale had created. The decision to sell a 12-year-old girl to finance decorative wallpaper represented such profound violation of maternal bonds that it transformed Margaret from patient craftsperson into calculating killer. The 4 months Margaret spent systematically poisoning Catherine through breakfast cheese represented not just revenge, but a reclamation of agency that slavery was designed to deny. Each contaminated wheel Margaret prepared, each morning's delivery of deadly dairy products disguised as nourishment, was an assertion that she remained a human being capable of acting on her own will rather than property, whose only purpose was serving her owner's interests. The ethical complexities of Margaret's actions remain unresolved, and perhaps unresolvable through simple moral frameworks. She committed murder through a method that was calculated, sophisticated, and completely premeditated actions that any ethical system would recognize as grave violations, regardless of context or justification. But she committed that murder within a system that had already committed grave violations against her, a system that had stolen her labor for 36 years, that had claimed ownership of her body and her daughter's body, that had sold that daughter like livestock to finance home decoration. Modern readers struggle with these situations where every available action involves moral compromise. Margaret could have done nothing, accepting Ruth's sale as one more horror in a system built on horror. But what mother could make that choice while maintaining any sense of her own humanity? She could have attempted to escape with Ruth before the sale was finalized, but the risks of being caught while fleeing were prohibitive, and capture would have resulted in punishments that might have killed them both. She could have begged Catherine to reconsider, but Catherine had already demonstrated that enslaved people's family bonds meant nothing to her compared to her desire for fashionable decoration. The option Margaret chose, using her expertise in fermentation to poison Catherine through contaminated cheese, delivered over months, violated fundamental moral principles, while also representing one of the few avenues available to an enslaved mother desperate to achieve some measure of justice for her daughter's destruction. The fact that this justice came too late to save Ruth, that it couldn't reunite mother and daughter or undo the separation that had shattered their family, added tragedy to the ethical complexity. Margaret's revenge against Catherine was complete and successful, but it couldn't heal the wound that Catherine's cruelty had inflicted. The cheese that Margaret had used as her weapon continued to be produced on countless dairy farms across Virginia and the broader South long after her departure, sustaining lives that depended on fermented food's nutritional value and economic importance. The fermentation processes that transformed milk into cheese remained mysterious to most people, even as the dairy industry grew throughout the 19th century, with farmers and dairy workers following traditional methods without understanding the invisible bacterial world that actually drove those transformations. Margaret's sophisticated knowledge of that invisible world knowledge that allowed her to cultivate deadly cultures alongside beneficial ones was exceptional even among people who worked with fermentation daily. This gap between practical dairy work and scientific understanding of fermentation chemistry meant that Margaret's method could have been replicated by others if they had possessed her specific knowledge about bacterial cultures and contamination. But most enslaved dairy workers lacked both the education Margaret had received from her African mother and the years of careful observation that had allowed Margaret to distinguish between safe and deadly fermentation outcomes. The result was that Margaret's murder of Catherine remained unique, a perfect crime that was never duplicated despite the countless other enslaved people who worked in positions that theoretically provided similar opportunities. The aging room on the former Randolph plantation, demolished decades after Margaret's departure, kept its secrets absolutely. No archaeological investigation has ever been conducted on the site where that stone chamber once stood, and no historian has thought to look for evidence of the deliberate contamination that occurred there more than 180 years ago. The bacterial cultures Margaret cultivated to kill Catherine have long since died or dispersed into the environment, leaving no trace that could be analyzed, even if researchers knew to search for them. The cheese wheels that delivered death through breakfast ritual were consumed completely, their deadly contents never suspected by the physicians who treated Catherine or by the officials who recorded her death as resulting from natural causes. Before we end, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story of Margaret Foster reminds us that history is written not just by the powerful, but also by those who found ways to resist power, who transformed their forced expertise into tools for their own purposes, and who understood that sometimes the longest path to justice begins with the smallest act of contamination introduced into milk before fermentation begins. The dairy woman who knew too much about bacteria and molds became the instrument of justice that the law would never provide, and the aging room that had been her professional pride became her laboratory for revenge, so perfectly executed that no one suspected murder until it was far too late for the victim to be saved. Margaret's legacy extended beyond her personal story to influence how enslaved people throughout the South understood the potential power embedded in specialized knowledge. The tale of the cheesemaker who had killed her mistress through contaminated dairy products spread through invisible networks, carried by enslaved workers who traveled between plantations, by free black people who maintained connections across state lines, and by the oral tradition that preserved information the written record would never acknowledge. Each retelling of the story reinforced the lesson that knowledge itself was power that couldn't be entirely controlled by those who claimed ownership over the people who possessed it. This understanding influenced how enslaved craftspeople approached their training and their work. Young people learning specialized trades heard Margaret's story and recognized that the skills they were acquiring served purposes beyond generating profit for enslavers. A dairy worker learning about fermentation understood she was also learning about bacterial cultures that could kill as well as nourish. A cook mastering food preservation recognized that the same knowledge that prevented spoilage could deliberately create contamination. A household worker handling medicines learned which substances healed and which substances harmed when dosages or combinations were altered. The system of slavery depended on extracting this specialized knowledge from enslaved workers, while simultaneously denying their full humanity and refusing to recognize that such knowledge could be weaponized against the people who claimed to own it. Enslavers wanted skilled craftspeople who could produce valuable goods and services, but they wanted those craftspeople to remain intellectually and emotionally limited to the narrow confines of their assigned tasks. Margaret Foster's story demonstrated the catastrophic failure of that contradiction. The dairy woman they had trained to produce exceptional cheese had used that same training to produce something deadly, and her expertise had been so superior to anything white observers understood that she had committed perfect murder while appearing to be nothing more than loyal servant. The physical remnants of Margaret's life have largely disappeared, scattered across time and geography in ways that make reconstruction difficult. The cabin where she lived with Samuel and Ruth on the Randolph plantation was torn down decades ago, its materials repurposed or left to decay until nothing remained. The stone aging room where she cultivated both legitimate cheese and deadly cultures was demolished and its stones scattered. The Philadelphia house where she lived during her years of freedom was destroyed during urban renewal projects in the 20th century. Even her grave marker in a Philadelphia cemetery has weathered to the point where her name is barely legible, slowly erasing the last physical evidence of her existence. But the story persists in oral tradition and in the collective memory of communities descended from enslaved people who heard about Margaret and recognized the significance of what she had accomplished. The details have changed through generations of retelling, some elements embellished while others were simplified or forgotten, but the core narrative remains intact. The dairy woman who used her expertise to kill the mistress who sold her daughter, who walked away with freedom earned through patient poisoning disguised as natural illness, who proved that specialized knowledge could become ultimate power when wielded by someone who understood both fermentation chemistry and the vulnerabilities of the people who claimed to own her. Hannah Turner, Ruth's younger sister who had been born after Ruth's sale, and who had grown up hearing stories about the older sister she had never known, occasionally spoke about her grandmother Margaret in interviews conducted during the early 20th century when researchers were documenting formerly enslaved people's descendants. Hannah had been born free in Philadelphia in 1847, part of the first generation of the Foster family to know liberty from birth, rather than achieving it through escape or manumission. She described Margaret as a woman of quiet dignity and fierce intelligence, someone who had survived horrors that Hannah's freeborn generation could barely comprehend. When interviewers asked Hannah whether she knew anything about the circumstances that had led to her grandparents' manumission from the Randolph plantation, she would respond with careful ambiguity that echoed the family's tradition of selective disclosure. "My grandmother was a cheesemaker, the finest in Virginia," Hannah would say. "She understood fermentation in ways that white dairy workers never did, knowledge passed down from her African mother. That knowledge was valuable enough that the plantation owner freed her when his wife died, recognizing that some expertise deserves freedom rather than bondage." The statement never quite confirmed or denied that Margaret had killed Catherine Randolph, but it conveyed enough information that perceptive listeners understood what Hannah was really saying. The cheese-aging room that no longer exists, the bacterial cultures that died generations ago, the contaminated wheels that were consumed completely, all of these have vanished from physical reality, leaving behind only stories and lessons about how resistance took forms that power never anticipated and couldn't effectively prevent. Margaret Foster's murder of Catherine Randolph represents one instance of a pattern that repeated across the slavery system wherever enslaved people possessed specialized knowledge and found themselves pushed beyond the breaking point where endurance became impossible and action became necessary regardless of risk. The question of whether Margaret's actions were justified remains contested and complex, admitting no simple answer that satisfies competing ethical frameworks. She killed a woman who had committed no crime under the laws of 1844 Virginia, a woman who was following accepted social practices of her time and place when she sold enslaved children to raise cash for household improvements. But she killed that woman in response to an act, the permanent separation of mother and child, that represented such profound violation of human bonds that it justified extreme response, if any response could ever be justified. The legacy of Margaret Foster's story lies not in resolving these ethical questions, but in illuminating the impossible choices that slavery created for people trying to maintain their humanity within a system designed to destroy it. The cheese she made was exceptional, the method she used to contaminate it was sophisticated, and the patience with which she executed her revenge over 4 months was extraordinary. These facts combine to create a historical account that challenges comfortable narratives about enslaved people's supposed passivity or about the security enslavers imagined they possessed through their control of law and violence. Margaret Foster's story whispers across centuries that knowledge is power, that patience can overcome force, and that the person who controls fermentation, who decides which bacteria thrive and which are suppressed, who understands which cultures nourish and which cultures kill, holds power that ownership cannot fully contain or control. The aging room is gone, the cheese has been consumed, and the woman who knew too much about bacteria and molds has been dead for more than 160 years. But the lesson remains, preserved in stories that refuse to be forgotten, despite the passage of time and the efforts of official history to erase resistance from the record of how enslaved people survived and sometimes triumphed over the system that claimed to own them, but could never fully possess their intelligence, their knowledge, or their capacity for calculated justice when circumstances demanded it.